So our first speaker is Riccardo Nanni. And Riccardo is a postdoc here at Leiden. He's really interested in hunting the most distant primordial black holes in the universe. The tools that he uses to do this are machine learning and big telescopes. And what he really wants to do is find the most distant black hole in the universe. But while he's not doing that, he's actually interested in how the ancient people used to live and survive. And part of this, he's built an interest in how the stars were important to ancient cultures, in particular the ancient Celts. So there's a fun fact about Riccardo, and he might have to explain this himself, because he said his fun fact is his profile picture. So Riccardo, you'll have to explain to us what you're doing in that picture, but over to you for your talk.
I would say that for me, the picture is funny just per se, because can you see like an astronomer dressed like that every day? I guess not, but the funny part is like, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that later, but the first time that I tried to do this kind of reconstruction, basically, I broke my hand. So, oops, what happened?
Sorry, can we just stop?
Okay, oh, thank you. So, yeah, that was very funny. I really felt the pain at the time, and I decided, yeah, I will also break the other one, so that's why I continued. So, basically, good evening, thank you for the presentation, Wendy, and I'm Riccardo, and today I'm going to be your local guide through this journey, through the past, trying to discover and understand the ancient astronomical knowledge of the old Celtic population. And I know you understand that this kind of topic is not exactly like a common one that you find during an astronomy type event, so before going into that, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about myself. So as when you were saying, what I'm basically am during my everyday life, I'm so-called a quasar hunter. So I basically stand all the day in front of a computer, just analyzing data and trying to find very distant supermassive black holes and quasars. And sometimes I also go to like a big telescope in order to collect other data. And that's basically my life as an astronomer. But during my, let's say, free time, I'm also an actor. If you don't know what a reenactor is, or what a reenactment event is, basically a reenactment event is a kind of event where weirdos like me just gather in one place, in this case in the northern part of Italy where I'm from, and what we do, like we spend an entire weekend or several days dressing and living out as our ancestors and trying to reconstruct how was the life at that time. So as you can see, this is basically me. With my armor, and what we do, like we do outreaches, we do workshop, and we do, something is happening here, okay. And so outreaches, workshop, and also basically some shows and performance for the public and for the tourists in order to make them understand how it was like the life back then. And so at some point I decided, why shouldn't I just merge what I like with what I'm doing in my life or job? So I started like reading and studying the works made by archaeoastronomers. And so even if that is not my topic, at some point I started doing also outreaches about old astronomical knowledge of old populations, and especially the Celts. And that's exactly what I'm going to do tonight. So tonight I'm going to talk about the Celts. The Celts were basically a group of people that were sharing the same kind of knowledge, beliefs, the same kind of culture, the same religion, the same language, but they were divided into many tribes, and they were also often at war among each other. Originally, they were coming from this region here, that includes like part of France, other part of Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and part of Czechia. And basically, let's say that this is the starting point, and then they just spread out everywhere. They started to colonize and conquer new land. And by 250, that's the scenario in Europe. They spread almost in everywhere in Europe, from Spain to France, Great Britain and Ireland, the Central Europe plus Northern Italy, some of the Eastern countries, plus also Turkey. So they went everywhere. But the problem is, we don't know that much about them for one simple reason. They didn't leave anything written about them. Not because they didn't know how to write, but they didn't write anything about them. themselves. So what we know nowadays is mostly based on what the other population wrote about them, mostly the Romans and the Greek. Especially the Romans, as you know, at a certain point the Republic of Rome decided that they needed space, and so they started conquering almost everything in Europe. And they basically conquered 90% of the land that was under, let's say, Celtic rule. And in that sense, somehow the Celtic culture were wiped out or merged together with the Latin kind of culture. And only in a very few places where the Romans basically weren't able to conquer, like mostly, I would say, Ireland, Scotland, or Wales. The Celtic culture just survived for longer compared to other places. And so that's the kind of problem. But what we know about them, especially coming from the Romans, we know that the Celtic population was divided into three classes. The first one is the class of the workers. Okay, maybe here the workers were trying to recover after a hangover because they probably drank the entire previous night. But, okay, here we have the real workers. So the real workers were roughly 90% of the entire tribe, and were composed mostly by foreignen, fishermen, and also craftsmen. Then we have the elite class. The elite class was made by warriors. These were basically the nobles, the chieftains, those that were leading the troops into battle during war times, and those that were basically commanding the village during peaceful times. But we have also another kind of elite class, and that's the druid. You can imagine the druid as some kind of sort of priests of that time, and that's somehow true. Like they were performing ritual, they know everything about the Celtic gods and blah blah blah. But they were more than that. They, as many like the typical kind of, you know, priest or religion class at that time, of many cultures, they were also the ancient scientists of that kind of society. So basically they were also philosophers, they were healers, they were mathematicians, and most importantly for tonight, they were also astronomers. And so here the question is, what kind of astronomical knowledge did they learn or did they develop at that time? Well, as many, let's say, people at that time, the main important technology they would like to have is like a calendar. Because if you think about that, even nowadays, it's very difficult, almost impossible to base our life without having a calendar. So like, there's no way you can do anything without scheduling your life. And that was true, especially at that time. And even if this kind of picture are somehow showing that I may be wrong, and that those, like, these people were having like more modern technologies at that time, actually it's not true. They didn't have any kind of written calendar, they didn't have smartphones, and since they were not writing, they didn't even have written anything. Nothing, no calendar at all. And here comes the question, so how do you pay, for example, the taxes to your chieftain if you don't know what day it is? How do you organize a date with a nice girl or a nice guy that you've met in your last grade if you don't have a calendar with you? But more importantly, how can you schedule the life and the survival of your village if you don't have a way to define a calendar? When, for example, to harvest, or where, for example, when to bring the animals into shelter instead of barn during winter time, if winter is coming. I mean, if winter is coming, you can still ask to Jon Snow, but if you've seen like Game of Thrones show, he knows nothing. So that's actually difficult. So how can you actually define a calendar if you don't write it down, especially? So there's an easy way to define a calendar. You can use the sun. We know, let's say that the Earth is orbiting around the sun. At that time, it was the vice versa. At least they thought vice versa, but still the same concept. And at the end, the Earth is going to take one solar year to orbit around the sun, and that's going to give you the definition of a year. Then, once you have the year concept, you can divide your year into seasons. And again, this is easy. You can still use the sun to define the seasons, as we do nowadays. You define, spring, winter, autumn, blah, 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 using something like the solstices and the equinoxes. And then you have your 4 seasons. But here come the questions. According to you, is it practical to have like a calendar that is divided into 4 seasons that are basically starting and ending using the solstices and equinoxes? If you think so, raise your right hand. Okay, if you don't think so, raise your left hand. Very shy people, I have to admit. Okay, well, if you say yes, I'm sorry to say you just failed your exam to become a druid. Because even if it's true that smart and it's easy to divide a year in that way, it's not practical at all. Think about that. If you have to schedule the survival of your village based on these dates, and you decide that each date is going to mark a specific task that your village should perform in order to survive, like, I don't know, is the winter solstice. You're going to bring your animal inside the bar in order to protect them from the cold weather. This is simply crazy and stupid, because the cold weather already started at least 1 month before. In my case, as I am from Italy, and the Netherlands, I would say it probably starts around October, but it's a matter of debate. So, it's not handy at all to use these kind of dates, because the weather is actually changing, not really when you have the solstice or the equinox, but it's like, basically they're changing somehow here in the middles of these 4 dates. So you have to define a calendar that's using some middle dates. And how do you define some middle dates if you don't have a written calendar? The answer is you need to find some kind of astronomical periodical events that are actually happening when the weather is changing. So exactly here in the middle. The question is, do we know or did they know some kind of astronomical events that happens exactly in these kind of days? Well, there are some events that you can use. And these are actually what we call heliacal risings. What's an heliacal rising? The definition is here. When a star first becomes visible above the eastern horizon at dawn, just before sunrise, after it has spent the season behind the sun, rendering it invisible. I'm going to explain it in words. If you have a star that's rising above the horizon, this star is having its heliacal rising when it's rising in the morning, almost at the same time as the sun. If that happens, it means that you're going to see the star rising. After that, you can see also like the sun is rising, and then you don't see any stars rising for that morning because the sunlight is going to basically shine everywhere, and you don't see any stars at all except from the sun. And an interesting fact is like this heliacal rising, so each star that's rising from the horizon is having its heliacal rising only once a year. So you just need to find which bright stars are having their heliacal rising in those dates, in those moments of the years in which the weather is changing, and then you have your reference marks for when to decide to begin or end one season or another. And that is exactly what the Druids did at that time. And why is it that the heliacal rising of a star is just happening once a year? This is basically coming from the definition of the sidereal and the solar day. What is the sidereal day? It's basically the time that it takes for Earth to just make a complete turn on itself. And it lasts for 23 hours and 56 minutes. But the problem is that the Earth is also orbiting around the Sun. So if I have to make the entire motion, just showing it to you, I'm going to be the Earth, you're going to be my reference point, and like this table is going to be the Sun. I'm going to do something like that. 23 hours, 56 minutes, I completed a turn on myself, but now the sun is not exactly in front of me, but it's slightly on my left. If I want to see it exactly in front of me, I have to turn a little bit more, like that. And this little bit more is going to take exactly 4 minutes more. So there's a difference between the solar day and the sidereal day of 4 minutes. And what does it mean that practically? It means that if one morning a star is having its heliacal rising, so it's rising together with the sun, the very next morning, this star is going to rise from the horizon, and the sun is going to rise with 4 minutes of difference. Then the very next morning, the star is rising, and the sun is rising with 8 minutes of difference, and so on and so forth. So basically, that means that each star is going to have its heliacal rising just once a year. So as I said, you just need to find the right star to define your calendar. And so, that's what the Druids did. They defined 4 seasons, like we also do nowadays, and these are the 4 festivities that were marking the beginning of a new season. The most important one, called Trinuxion Samani, was the beginning of winter and the beginning of the new Celtic year. It's called nowadays with another name, Samhain or Shamain. I don't know if Irish people are here, can correct me please. But Trinuxion means that it was lasting for 3 nights. It was starting roughly around the 31 of October, Halloween, It was ending the 2nd of November, All Saints' Day. It's still celebrated somehow nowadays with a different concept, different meaning, let's say, but it's still the same kind of festivity. And it was also the day in which they were celebrating the dead people, as we also do nowadays during that kind of time. Then we have Imbolc. Imbolc is the beginning of spring. It was happening between the end of February and the beginning of March, roughly. And is the kind of festivity dedicated to the goddess Brick or Brigantia. Brick or Brigantia was one of the most important goddesses of the Celtic pantheon and was the god that was taking care about the farming season, the animals, this kind of stuff, the spring. Then we have the summer, we have Beltane, still celebrated also nowadays, around the 1st of May. It was the festivity dedicated to Belenos, the god of fire. And then the last one was Lughnasadh, the beginning of autumn, around the middle of August, was dedicated to the most important god of the Celtic pantheon, the god Lugh. And it was also the day in which people from different tribes were gathering together in order to make, deals, marriages, and this kind of stuff. And as I said, there was a way to understand when these festivities were actually happening, because they were marked by some specific kind of stars that the Druids basically chose at that time. So for Tnuximsamani we have Antares, for Imbolc we have Capella, for Beltane we have Aldebaran, and for Lughnasadh we have Sirius. The stars are also related with the meaning of the different festivities. For example, Aldebaran is a red star. It's used for the god of fire, Belenos. Lughnasadh, it's a Lugh. It was the most important god in the Celtic pantheon. Sirius is the most bright star, is the brightest star that you can see in the sky at night. And the same somehow goes also with Capella, since also Brick was very, very important in the Celtic pantheon. And we know also about these kind of things because the Celts, or let's say the Druids, built these kind of structures that are called nemeton or nemeta in plural. These are some kind of open-air sanctuaries that were used mostly to perform like kind of rituals, everything that is like religion stuff related. But the interesting part is like astronomer, by analyzing the orientation of this nemeton and the superficial some substructure, like you can see there are like some tree trunks and manure that were like put in there. They saw that basically this kind of like substructure are marking some specific direction, and once they reconstructed what was the kind of horizons, like the sky that could be seen at that time from these kind of centuries, these kind of directions were marking the direction where the elite rising of the stars that I showed you before were actually happening. So they were basically using this kind of centuries to orientate themselves in order to see when the different kind of important astronomical events were actually happening. And that means that basically these kind of places were not just places to perform religious ritual, but were also places in which they could use them as some kind of observatories. You can see it as the grandfather of nowadays telescope, maybe. Not the same kind of technology yet, but pretty close to it. So unfortunately, I feel that this is roughly the end of my presentation. Even if there's much more that I can tell you about that, I'm very happy about answering your questions later. But my only take-home message that I would like to tell you, let's say, is that even if we all studied the Celts, but also the Germans and other populations at that times were basically barbarians, because at least that's what the Romans and sometimes also the Greeks told us about them, and that's what we learned at school. At the end of the day, if you are able to study better and go into the kind of stuff that they were able to leave, since they didn't leave anything written, then you understand that these kind of people were less barbarians than we thought. And that said, both me and also my reenactment group, and also the Leiden Observatory, we would like to thank you for your attention.
Great, thanks for that very interesting talk, Riccardo. If there are any questions, repeat the question so that our recording hears it. So, question here?
Question?
Yeah, on your like on this slide, it says that the Celts were able to craft and shape glass.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't really say anything about that, but did they use that for any astronomical purposes?
So no, I didn't say anything about that because like these are some take-home messages that I usually provide in our like broader kind of presentations. Related to that, there is this kind of picture. That's one of like this is a kind of oven that we also use, but it's based on like some historical evidence that they use to produce glass. It doesn't have any astronomical meaning, but we know that, for example, at that time, the Celts were one of the few people inside Europe that were basically able to shape glass. Glass was probably produced in the Middle East, maybe like Egypt, and then was brought into Europe, and around 500 before Christ, only the Celts had the technology to take this kind of like raw glass and give it a shape. Yeah, so they were pretty advanced by that time.
Other questions?
Question?
Thank you for your talk. Nice to see that you also lived the life of the Celts. So you have some experience.
Yeah. I can tell you something more about it.
I wonder, when it was overcast, it was very difficult to find out when the season started. So were they able to count? Do they have a counting system?
So basically, that's the point. Like after observing for many years, they use this kind of reference point to say, okay, now it's the beginning. Even if, for example, the summer, like the weather was changing a little bit later than the Leiden rising itself was beginning during the Leiden rising, because the error was probably very small at that time. They of course have method to count, but we are not aware about the fact that they were using like some kind of counting thing. If you are more let's say if you are asking more about counting, for example, the month, the single month, they had a way in counting the month that was basically using lunar, so like a moon, using the moon for the calendar. So the moon was used for the single days, the Leiden rising, and the month. Let's say the Leiden rising were used mostly for the seasons and the solar year to define the solar, the year concept. And just to tell you about living back then, I can assure you that there are people always asking me if I'm living like that every day. And I usually say, yeah, you know, Milady, or like, sir, like if you're coming back here on Wednesday, you can still find me like here hunting for boars to survive and all this kind of stuff. Sure. Yeah, that's my basic, my life. I went all of it. Yeah.
Any other questions? Great. No, well, Riccardo is here if you have anything more. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you could all give him a round of applause.